Live stream is on.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully this is working, given it just stopped for reasons unknown. We are going to have a show tonight. How long, we'll see. We'll get, just because I have not been feeling terrifically great today, but I did not, for the sake of the fact we need content and continuity, I did not want to just cancel. So, Brian, jingle some keys or something while I post links.
Laser mouse.
Okay, that's one place. I don't hear no keys.
Yeah. I actually can't. I don't think I have my keys.
Oh, well, I'm almost done posting. Everybody just bear with me. Encyclopedia post.
My scholarly look.
Oh, God, help us.
Now everyone will take me
Wait.
much more seriously.
Okay, it seems to be working. Hey, Lisa Fritz, welcome to the chat. Great to see you, actually. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to try and do a show tonight. I am not having the best of days. Not feeling well on top of that. I'm not sure if I ever mentioned this. Not this past Halloween, but the Halloween before, I fell and broke a whole bunch of bones. One of which is the orbit under my right eye. The other is my arm in 4 different places. My arm healed just fine. I still get pain in my eye socket from time to time. It's gotten better, but unfortunately, this is one of the particularly bad days. And then, of course, there's the technical problems we had just as we started the stream. So I promise we're going to try and do a show. I don't promise how long it's going to be, but we should be back next week as well. But let's get this started. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist, paranormal investigator, and the Paranormal Encyclopedia. I am joined by my co-host,
Brian McKinley, author of vampire thrillers and general author, skeptic type person.
And we all need to congratulate Brian because he just completed the first draft on his new book.
Yes, the sequel to Drawing Dead.
The cover of which you can see on his screen.
Yeah. So that'll be out now shortly. I'm aiming for Valentine's Day.
Yeah, which is highly appropriate. You and I both know we discussed it, but we have apparently 1 to 3 people in chat listening live. So I'm curious if anybody can tell me in the chat the connection between a very famous vampire and Valentine's Day. You get 10,000 respect points if you can. And 9,999 if you can, because we respect our audience anyway.
all 3 of them.
We usually get up to 6 or 7, at least within a week or so of episodes going up. I'll say that much. Anybody know? I'll even give you a hint. It connects Dracula to Valentine's Day. Circa pre-World War I or II. Pre-World War II. After World War I. Okay, because I don't know how to read how many people are watching right now anyway, so I am going to give the answer. The answer is that it was on February 14th, 1931, that a movie billed as the strangest love story of all, a.k.a. Todd Browning's Dracula, yes, that's the one with Bela Lugosi, first aired in theaters. But we're not here to talk about Dracula. As hard as longtime viewers may find that to believe, we're here to talk about witchcraft. Particularly, once again, we're going to talk about the topic of my ongoing research and hopefully one day soon book, the Salem Witch Trials.
Yes.
What's interesting to note here, and I want to start with something I don't actually know much about. I keep meaning to do more research into it. Certainly need to do more research for the book, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. Salem is the most famous witch trials to happen in the United States. It's not the first. You know where the first witch trials in the U.S. started?
Weren't there some in Plymouth?
These weren't the ones I'm talking about. Are not Massachusetts.
Okay. This sounds like something I knew or heard
Probably.
at one point and have forgotten.
Known as the Hartford Trials, they took place in Connecticut.
Okay, that was not what I was thinking of.
They're generally, I believe, thought to be the first witch trials to happen in the United States. There are other witch trials that happen in places other than Massachusetts and Connecticut. For example, one of my personal favorite witch trials happened in Pennsylvania, where a woman, a Swedish immigrant, was accused of witchcraft, along with one of her neighbors. The trial was presided over by William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania Penn's Woods. And during the trial, he asked the woman, "Is it true that you fly about at night on a broomstick?" Now, we know as a matter of historical record that she said yes. Most historians are inclined to believe, and I'm kind of inclined to agree with them, that this wasn't a confession so much as a language problem. Because as I said, she was Swedish. English was not her native language.
Okay.
What's brilliant about it is William Penn's response to her confession, which was, "I'm not aware of a law against flying around on a broomstick."
It's very true.
She was ultimately not quite found guilty, as I understand it, but required to pay a small fine. And she was unsurprisingly, for the time period in her age, she was a married woman. Her husband was wealthy, so it wasn't an onerous fine or any other kind of problem. But that was it. She wasn't tortured. She wasn't drowned. She wasn't hanged. Which I guess is another good thing to address. In no trial that happened on American soil were witches burned. I feel like most people know this. If only because, like, if you ask any remotely historical source, what's one common misconception about the Salem witch trials? They'll tell you that witches were burned in Salem.
Yeah. But this is a good opportunity to go through all the various misconceptions, like I've always heard, like the mushroom theory.
Ergot, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, that's not actually a mushroom, but it is a good point about a theory that is commonly circulated but incorrect. There is a type of mold, actually, so you're not far off.
Mold, yeah.
Called ergot that is known to infect wheat. Ergot poisoning is known to cause hallucinations. So it has commonly been theorized for a few decades now, it's not an old theory, that outbreak of ergot poisoning on their wheat caused hallucinations and are the reason for the trials. This does not work for a couple of reasons. First, if the wheat supply in any extent was infected, the whole town should have been hallucinating. There were a lot of people who had hallucinations or claimed to have seen something, whether it was a hallucination or not. But it wasn't everyone. And it wasn't just people in Salem, it were people in Boston and other surrounding areas that were making these accusations. It isn't realistic that it would have been that widespread. Another basic problem with it is, yes, hallucinations are one of several symptoms of ergot poisoning. there's no evidence. Seizures are another one, which isn't consistent with the girl's behavior. Furthermore, the thing about ergot poisoning is once it gets to the point that it would have been at, if it was the cause, it's both irreversible and fatal. And we have records of what happened. We don't have records of a sudden mass dying off the people making these accusations, or that they continue to hallucinate long after the trial. It's just not a good explanation.
Sure.
Another very common explanation that's better in some ways is mass. I forget the full technical term for it, but basically boils down to mass hysteria.
Right.
That where a large group of people can be convinced of a delusion. This fits the classic image of the people who made accusations very well, because this is, and I don't mean disrespect, I'm just reporting based on the numbers, on the information I've seen in scientific studies, but it's most common in teenage girls, usually in high school. Not to go further out on even thinner ice, it's particularly common in cheerleaders and other popular girl groups. But it tends to be a tight-knit group of people, usually around high school age. There were dozens of accusers, men and women. And one of the interesting things you find out is a fair number of the women making accusations weren't these pubescent girls that people think of. The first three that made accusations were around 12, like the 12, 13-year-old range. But a lot of the other ones were married women, even women in their 40s, which, believe it or not, by Puritan standards, could make you a spinster. You didn't have to be that old to be considered a spinster. There were older people. There was a wide range of people, and that's the problem. Is there isn't really everyone wants to make a very simple "this is what happened" explanation, and there are things that fit some of the facts. For example, there is good reason to think that the trials began because Reverend Parris, who was a reverend of Salem Village at the time, was worried about losing his job. We know that he was concerned about losing his job. We know that the village went through multiple pastors in a relatively short period of time before him. Because there's a whole bunch of political drama going on here as well. Because the fact, as I said, Salem Village, everybody thinks of Salem as the site of the trials. It was actually this other next door neighbor community called Salem Village, which isn't even part of modern Salem and does have a different name today. And then there's a whole lot of political problems with the divisions between what's a town and what's a village at the time. The village tended to be more the farmers, if memory serves. But we know that he was in danger of losing his job. We know that one of the first three women to be accused was his house slave, Tituba. It was probably one of the most famous women to be accused. And that the first person to confess, in fact, she did it in her, as far as I can tell, at least of the surviving documents, certainly her first testimony, or the first time she was questioned, she was the first person to confess. Later, around 1700, she would tell the author of a book called More Wonders of the Invisible World that Reverend Parris had severely beaten and abused her, forcing her to confess. So I think there's an excellent argument to be made that it started with somebody worried about losing his job. And, there's witches. Satan is among us. You need a man of God, a strong man of God, to save you from the witches.
Create a common enemy.
Yeah. And that's something else I think that's worth looking at. is a lot of people, when they think of Salem, they're a little confused by how this happened. Because when you look at this modern mindset, people think of the idea of witches as something you see in movies or television, or people think of witches as a neo-pagan religion commonly known as Wicca. Many people, even many Christians today, when you talk about Satan, it's this vague, impersonal force. It's the name we give to evil. It's not. He's not somebody you could say have an argument with. Whether you believe
just don't
that's
get that
true,
personal service anymore.
exactly. But whether that's true of Satan in general, obviously, it's no secret to anyone who's ever seen this show. I don't agree with that view of Satan. But whether that's true or not in a philosophical or scientific sense, the thing to understand about Salem is they were God's, in their view, the Puritans were God's chosen people. Satan was very real and hated the colony. They were trying to save Christianity because they believed it had become corrupted by the papists, the Catholics. They separated from the Anglican Church because they thought it was still too Catholic. So they were the true Christians. And if this sounds like modern evangelicals, yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And Satan was at war with them. And witches were real, and witches had power. And King James I, who, despite being an Anglican, his view of witches in his book Demonology had a strong influence on Puritan thought on the subject. Basically outlines two types of people. They get in league with the devil. Necromancers, which in his worldview aren't people that summon spirits of the dead. They're what we think of as a wizard. People who summon up demons, that cast magic spells, and do things like that. And very much the D&D sense of wizards, in fact, where they're getting their spells from books and formal incantations and complex rituals. And then there are witches, which are usually where necromancers are usually motivated by a lust for knowledge. They get started in astronomy or astrology, and he actually distinguishes between the two, or herbalism, or all these other subjects, and starts studying them and going from using astronomy in approved ways, like, for example, they believed at the time that your astrological chart, as we see it today, influenced your medical health. And that using it, astronomy, knowledge of the stars that way, using it to predict the weather, to predict a meteor shower, things like that, was all valid and within God's way of working the universe. But trying to use it to tell the future starts to become problematic. Trying to conjure evil spirits and things like that. But again, it's still out of this search for knowledge and search for understanding. Well, they thought that witchcraft was mostly out of a desire for revenge. It was more primal. Needless to say, because of this, most necromancers were seen as men. Most witches were seen as women. Even George Burroughs, who is one of the most interesting, in my opinion, people accused of witchcraft, for a couple of reasons. One being, he is one of only 4 men that were executed in Salem for witchcraft. 5 if you count Giles Corey, but I don't. We can circle back to that. But 2, he was a Puritan minister. They hanged as a witch. He was one of the last people hanged in Salem for witchcraft. And as his final act of defiance, he led the others in reciting the Lord's Prayer, something that the Puritans and most other people at the time thought witches were incapable of doing. Because it was believed that during satanic rituals, they would recite the Lord's Prayer backwards. So it was thought they did that so often they lost the ability to say it properly, and they'd always make a mistake. And of course, he recited it. He was a minister, for heaven's sakes. He recited it perfectly, and they hanged him anyway. Which is a long commentary on the hypocrisy of the way the trials were handled. But the other thing that's interesting about him is there's enough hints here and there that some historians think that while he wasn't a witch or a wizard, he's commonly called the necromancer or a wizard, that he might have been a pretty terrible human being. One of the big ways that Puritans are, like I said, there's a lot of overlap between Puritans and modern evangelicals. There's some important differences, though. One of the ones I find the most interesting is that Puritans made a very big deal of education. Keep in mind, Harvard was founded by the Puritans as a seminary, as were a couple of other important schools in New England. They felt that everyone's relationship with God and the Word of God, meaning the Bible, was deeply personal. So you had to be able to read the Bible to properly be a Christian. So the majority of Puritan boys were literate. The number of Puritan girls that were literate was lower, but not by much. Most children knew how to read. And that was religiously important to these people. Another interesting difference is doesn't relate to the triads as well at all, but it's interesting in my opinion, so I'm going to share it. They saw marriage as a purely civil affair. If you wanted a divorce, and this included women, you went to court and you got a divorce. It wasn't the church's problem. That didn't mean divorce was common, particularly for women, but at least within the laws of the colony, a woman could file for divorce for being abused, for example. And the church wouldn't disown her, wouldn't shun her. It didn't matter. It wasn't a religious issue. But the other thing that's interesting that comes into play here is where many modern Christians don't believe in ghosts. They particularly among evangelicals, they believe that any experience a person has of a ghost is actually a demon, or more rarely, maybe an angel in disguise. The Puritans absolutely believed in ghosts, as in human spirits that came back from the dead. Because here's the thing, here's where the whole thing comes together and gets interesting, in my opinion. The accusers claimed that the two previous wives of George Burroughs, both of whom had died, came to them and cried out for revenge because he had murdered them. Well, a lot of historians don't go so far as to say he was a murderer. There is a lot of speculation that he might have been very abusive. And that's a thing you run into sometimes. There are a few times you look at people and it's like, they probably weren't witches. That doesn't mean they were upstanding people.
Maybe it was just that was the only thing they could get him on.
Yeah. For that matter, funny enough, and I'm going to say something that's going to likely be unpopular. By the standards of the Puritans, some of them were witches. There's at least one woman, and I forget which one, who was caught with a book on fortune telling, which to modern people, that's not witchcraft. That's a hobby. Reading tarot cards and poems and things like that's a diversion. To the Puritans, it was witchcraft and being in league with Satan. The other two common things that we know both from records and archaeological discoveries is you'd find houses that would have either a horseshoe or a pitchfork, a small handheld pitchfork, made out of iron hung above the door. These are not symbols of. These were not seen by the people who put them up as witchcraft. In fact, they were protection from witchcraft and demons. Right. But again, to Puritans, it's witchcraft. The last and the most straightforwardly occult is there's some evidence that a number of what are called poppets were found in houses. For those of you who don't know, Brian, you know what a poppet is? I know we've talked about it before.
Yeah, it's what people think of as a voodoo doll, but is the actual real source of the idea.
Yes, Brian is absolutely correct. Puppets are an idea from Western European magic, where you make a doll to represent a person. You include hair or nail clippings or a bit of clothing, and then you do stick the doll with a pin to hurt the person. This is an idea that is used in hoodoo. We've talked about this before, but as a gentle reminder, voodoo is a religion. It is a mixture of traditional African tribal beliefs and Christianity, mainly Catholicism. You do not have to use voodoo dolls or create zombies to practice voodoo any more than you have to go to mass in a Catholic church every Sunday to be a generic Christian. Hoodoo is a magical practice. That's where voodoo dolls come in. That's where, if you've ever heard of gree bags, which are it's a bag with various occult ingredients like graveyard dirt, bones, and things of that nature. And you usually bury them like under your doorstep or under an enemy's doorstep to either protect yourself or curse someone else. And it's done both ways. It's not just to hurt people. Many people who practice voodoo as a religion also practice hoodoo. But not everyone who practices voodoo practices hoodoo, and not everyone who practices hoodoo believes in voodoo. You will find, particularly in New Orleans, where all this stuff has a long history, many very wealthy people who are devout Catholics, go to church every Sunday, all the holidays, are regularly in confession, consider voodoo the work of Satan, will do charms and gree bags to protect themselves from people who practice who are trying to curse them. And yes, the idea of the puppet got brought in. It got confused, I think, to some extent with an African tradition. Remember, mixture of European occultism and African tribal magic. But in Africa, they use dolls, and you stick the pins into the doll, but it's supposed to help a person. Where you put the pin and the note that you write attached to the pin indicates what they need help with. You put it in one place for money, one place for stomach problems, and so forth. It's not to say it can't be used and it couldn't be turned around and used destructively, but its inherent purpose was not evil. All of which I think segues nicely into one of the most common misconceptions people have about the witch trials, which can be neatly summarized as nearly everything people think they know about Tituba. This is what really surprised me when I started doing research, because I grew up on the play The Crucible and all the various works derived from The Crucible, which gives you the impression that Tituba was an African slave who practiced voodoo. For a start, she wasn't African. Most historians now agree, and it makes sense when you put it together, that she was a member of an indigenous tribe known as the Carib. The Carib are native to the Caribbean, hence the name Caribbean. Particularly, in her case, she came from the island of Barbados, which has a Carib population, and we know, as a matter of record, that Reverend Parris, who was her owner, brought her with him from Barbados, where he had been before moving to Salem. The other big clue here is she was married. In fact, her husband was one of the people who made accusations. Her husband's name, John Indian. Kind of a big hint, we're not talking about people from Africa. The next big mistake everybody makes is there's no evidence at all she practiced voodoo or any other tribal religion from the area. I'm not really sure if there's any record of what religion she practiced, if any. Well, she probably at least paid lip service to Christianity because of the nature of the time period. But this whole idea that she taught the girls to look into a glass with egg yolks. Now, looking into a glass full of egg yolks or whites, I forget. But anyway, to see the future is absolutely something the girls of Salem were doing. But they didn't learn it from her. So where did it come from, you may ask? As you may know, remember from being a kid yourself, kids often like playing with the occult. These days, you have the whole ritual pasta thing. You know, if you go back far enough, we've interviewed my friend Lupus Creepus, and how you do various things, and a ghost will possess a doll, and the doll will chase you around the house, or you can summon the Satan by doing certain things. So that's a big thing now. You know, when I was a kid, and Brian, when you were a kid, Bloody Mary was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or light as a feather, stiff as a board was very popular.
Yeah.
Or there are other games of the sort. 21 Doors. There is the Black Aggie ritual, which is basically Bloody Mary, but it's pretty much unique to Maryland. One time we have John on, we should talk to him about Black Aggie, because it's an actual statue that used to be in Maryland, but is now in Washington, D.C. Because it was taken and is now part of the Smithsonian. And I want to say more because it's interesting, and I know John has researched it because it appears in some of his books. At any rate, the egg thing was a kid's parlor game to try to see the future and get into all the occult witchy things that their parents didn't approve of. The parents hated it. The clergy hated it. They all thought it was satanic. But it wasn't a form of voodoo. Nor did she teach the girls to dance in the woods. How do I know this? That is a fair. People may wonder. When you have all these other sources saying one thing, how do I know better? Well, partly it is reading reading historians. Like there's an excellent book called Storm of Witchcraft. But another really good way is I've read the trial transcripts for Tituba. They don't mention the egg. They don't mention dancing. There's nothing in it consistent with African or Haitian voodoo practices or Santeria or any of the other related religions. It's very generic Western European witchcraft she gets accused of, which is not similar to voodoo. I've talked for quite a bit. Oh, before I ask what I was about to ask, Chris Blermo said, I could not tell the difference from a ghost and a living person. So as a 10-year-old talking to another child that happened to be dead for a few years, so I was talking to a demon or a ghost. It's hard to say, given this is some time ago, so I can't go investigate directly, but probably a ghost. Which isn't to rule out imaginary friends, although many imaginary friends are actually some type of spirit. But even that, monsters under the bed and imaginary friends are often spirits of some kind. That's not to say that they're malevolent. Ghosts, ancestors coming by to visit, your guardian angel, fairies with a weird sense of humor. There's a lot of weird things out there. It's not as simple as ghosts and demons or ghost angels and demons. But I was going to say, Brian, do you have any questions or anything you would like to add?
I think you covered a lot. Are there any other popular misconceptions that you've found that you could speak to?
I'd say that I think people get the impression that torture was a lot more common in Salem than it actually was. I mean, don't misunderstand me. The treatment in the jails was abominable. So of all the people that died in Salem, 19 were hanged. One man was crushed to death. Another 5 died in prison, probably of malnutrition. They weren't fed properly. They kept in terrible conditions. But there wasn't this idea that was very much a thing in Europe, although by the 17th and 18th centuries it certainly started to fall out of fashion. But the torture wasn't as common. I can't speak to the Connecticut trials, but as far as I know, and certainly I haven't seen anything in the records I've read through, the whole idea of, you throw the woman in the water, and if she floats, she's a witch, and if she's drowned, she's okay. I think that may have happened in Connecticut. I'm not certain. I've certainly heard it associated with American witches, but I haven't found anything relating to Salem. Particularly because you'd think there'd be, so, I would have, if that was the case, you'd think I would have said 19 hanged, 1 crushed, 5 died in prison, and 6 more drowned because they were innocent.
Yeah.
Or even 1, because there was a reality, at least in theory, my understanding was they were supposed to tie a rope to you and if you started to drown, haul you out.
But of course, if you weighed the same as a duck,
yeah, it's much simpler.
That was also proof that you were a witch. How else would you float?
Stupid duck. I will say a lot of what. There was something I was going to end there. Yeah, Georgia wasn't that common. I'd also say a lot of what witches could do is interesting, particularly because of how much. One of those common things that Salem and most other trials thought witches could do was control the weather. They could whistle up a storm, for example. What I find interesting about this is if you read St. Augustine of Hippo, which is one of the early important writers in Christianity, he argued very explicitly against even the existence of witches. Why? Because he thought that the weather was only under God's dominion. The idea that a human could command the weather, or even that Satan could command the weather, to him was heresy. You're saying that a mere fallen angel has the power of God. Which is why in reality, to step out of America for once, a crazy thought, to remember that there's more to the world than one country, but just for the sake of argument, in a lot of the history of the Catholic Church, it has a really complicated relationship to the idea of witches. Particularly prior to, I want to say, the 14th century, it wasn't that uncommon that if somebody called the church in to investigate a witch, the witch was let out of prison and the person who made the accusation went into prison. Because again, this idea from Augustine, that the idea that witches existed itself was heretical. So the witch is innocent. They can't do that. Humans can't do that. You're a heretic for thinking they can. You go to prison. But that's a slippery concept because they go back and forth on that.
Yeah.
All through history, starting, of course, in the 14th century, there's drastic climate change in Europe for reasons we honestly don't know. But it's called the Little Ice Age, and there's a period of centuries where the world just slumps into a cooling period. Crops die. Domesticated animals die. Wild animals start going crazy. And that's when the idea of witches and witch trials really started to catch off. Because it became a scapegoat to blame these problems for this freak weather patterns. And again, the interesting thing I think here is, honestly, as I've checked scientific and historical and secular sources, they really don't seem to know what caused it. There's a number of theories, really relating to like volcanic eruptions and things, and maybe an asteroid strike or two, and things of that nature. But nobody really knows for certain. Really, the fact that we're talking about,
or not Gulf Stream, but that transatlantic current or whatever it is, or
maybe
things like that.
And there's also the problem, and we're not talking about a time of modern meteorology or any of the modern sciences that might have been able to go, oh, look, this is what happened. This is why everything's going to gold.
Yeah.
If we had that, maybe we would have had witch trials. Then again, just the 20th century, we probably would have anyway. Oh, God. But, and that's, I think, a lot of why people have so many misconceptions about Salem's trials, though, is there were trials in Salem, there were trials in all over Europe. And people get the two confused.
Yeah.
That's why, like, the TV show, and it gets a bit of a pass because it's fiction. The TV show Sleepy Hollow claims hundreds of women were burned in Salem for witchcraft. It's like, at best, about maybe 150 to 200 people, men and women, although mostly women, were accused of witchcraft in Salem. So no, hundreds of people weren't executed.
Yeah.
That's closer to true in Europe, where actually the number's probably in the thousands, maybe tens of thousands. But even there, it gets grossly over-exaggerated because there's a common number you will find online, and is particularly popular among Wiccans and other neo-pagan sources, of 9 million women were being burned. They call the witch trials the burning times. First, there's no way on earth 9 million people were, 9 million men and women, let alone just women, were killed as witches through the entire medieval period of witch hunts. The way they came up with that number is they took like the period of time where the most trials and executions happened, or at least a lot of them happened, and just assumed that every year that many people were dying through the entire period, which is ridiculous. Because there are decades in that time period where nobody was executed in much of Europe for witchcraft.
Yeah.
Other decades where more people were executed, And here's the other thing. It is absolutely a fact that people in Europe were burned as witches, alive. It wasn't as common as people think. I want to say total there was something like 100,000 witch trials in Europe. Not individual people, but trials. Because sometimes, a whole group of people were tried at once. Out of them, about 30% ended in execution. The rest were banished, which is not a great thing. I'm not saying it's wonderful to be banished, but it beats being burned alive.
Yeah.
And of the people who were executed, most of the time, their heads were cut off, they were strangled, they were drowned, they were killed in some other fashion, and then the body was burned at the stake. Can you guess why? And you, of all people, should know this.
So they can come back as vampires?
Yes. Because what's pretty much the most common way to get rid of a vampire in folklore, in European folklore?
Oh, yeah, definitely burning or dismembering in some capacity.
Yeah, you usually burn the body. So witches were burned at the stake. It meant they didn't come back. But, well, again, I am not saying it is okay to execute people ever. I am not a believer in the death penalty. And I'm certainly not saying that it is acceptable to execute people for a made-up charge. If you have to die, I think I'd rather have decapitation than being burned alive. I don't know about you.
It's a lot quicker, yeah.
Yeah, a lot less painful, I would think, too. Of the other methods named, it's like, yeah. I mean, strangulation doesn't sound great, but then probably I'd rather not be drowned of the other ones. This is supposed to be one of the most painful ways to die.
Yeah, they're both. That not being able to breathe is a pretty terrible feeling.
Oh no, having been there, yeah, I can agree.
Yeah.
Although your lungs filling up with water on top of not being able to breathe, I think is probably worse. Grant, this reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite book series of all time, which opines, really? Okay, I'll come back to what I just said really in a second. But it opines that you can strangle a chicken or you can cut a chicken's head off. But what difference does it make to the chicken? Still dead. Now, what surprised me in a very pleasant way is our total views for the stream is 14, excuse me.
Oh, nice.
Which is really good for us.
Yeah.
But we're coming up on 8:47, and talking is not helping the pain I'm having up here. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Do you have anything you want to add before we get going?
No, I mean it's always interesting, that period of history is very often misunderstood and misconstrued through popular history. So I always like learning about the reality.
See, the time we really need to come back and revisit the subject, because I think I'll have a lot to say that'll be interesting, is so I've got a line of books I'm digging through for my notes. At the moment, I'm on a book called Wonders of the Invisible World by Cotton and Crease Mather, who were two of the most prominent Puritan proponents of the witch trials. Very respected theologians, moral philosophers. Even despite his disdain for organized religion and his disdain for witch trials, even Ben Franklin had respect for Cotton Mather and even met him before Mather died at his home in Mather's home in Boston. But from there, I have more Wonders of the Invisible World, which is actually funny enough. This is all BS book. And then the one I particularly want to talk about when I get through it is A Modest Perspective on Witchcraft, which was written by, oh good heavens, I can't think of his name. And this is embarrassing. Hale. Is it John Hale? Yes, John Hale. John Hale was a Puritan minister who took an active part in the trials. He was another one of the most prominent influential ministers involved, and very much early on was very much in support of the trials. But as time wears on, he wound up becoming very critical of them. What I find interesting, as I understand it, about his book, The Modest Inquiry, is he takes the perspective that Satan and his demons were directly involved in the trials. Not that they were, making deals and turning people into witches and all this stuff, but that they were impersonating the people making the accusations and attacking the people that were being afflicted. Basically, that the demons were manipulating people to get the innocent people killed.
Yeah.
Which is like a really interesting perspective, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It's just before I do that, before I get to the skeptical perspectives, I want to slog through what people who believed in witches said.
Yeah.
Which means reading, I got to finish the Wonders, and actually the next book will probably be, despite the fact it reads like medieval Serio instructions, which is Malleus Maleficarum, which is the Catholic Church's big book on how to kill witches. Because again, well, they didn't like the Catholics. A lot of this folklore and mythology of witches overlaps.
Yeah. All right.
And no, I'm sorry. One more thing. I still want to say this is fun. My favorite story, true quote unquote story of things that witches do. Witches would steal men's private parts and keep them as pets.
Yeah.
That's a story from the Malleus. Leading our friend one time when I mentioned it to him, Patrick Thomas, suggesting that you have a short story where the witch hunters go after the witch and the witch sticks their private parts on them. Which is definitely a unique take on the subject, I have to say.
Yeah, that's not one that I've heard.
But it is an actual part of witch folklore. So as ridiculous as it is, not just it sounds, it's ridiculous that they believe that, let alone as a story concept. It would be accurate to the folklore of the time.
Nice.
But on that cheerful and G-rated note, because that would totally be a family movie, I think we're going to wrap it up. Folks, I want to thank the 16 total viewers we've had tonight, or views, I guess. It may have been people coming back. I don't know. Whatever it is, I want to thank people for tuning in. I've had a lot of fun hanging out with you and with my good friend Brian. We will be back next week at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with a topic of some kind, I promise. I don't promise I know what, because I don't. But until then, this is Kevin Mears, demonologist and Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying good night and God bless. Brian?
Brian McKinley saying keep your fangs sharp.
Good night, ladies and gentlemen. And we are done.